Good morning and welcome to the weekly intelligence briefing brought to you by Washington Post Intelligence. I'm Louisa Savage, editorial director of Washington Post Intelligence, and I'm thrilled to welcome you back to what we hope will be a valuable and highly interactive 60 minutes. If this is your first time joining us, a little bit about WP Intelligence and why we're here. With your participation, we are creating a new and different approach to media. Washington Post Intelligence is a premium analysis service aimed at business and policy leaders like yourselves, and it's also a community conversation among decision makers, analysts, and policymakers who are navigating global power, policy, and markets. And your voice shapes it. Your questions, whether you ask them here, over coffee, or in an email, they help guide our reporting and our priorities. So my email's on your screen, and I invite you to please use it, and I would very much like to hear from you. And if you're not yet a subscriber and you'd like full access to our briefings, our reports, and our interviews, please click the link in the chat to request a free demo of our platform. And here's what your subscription unlocks: weekly intelligence reports that are written like high-level cables with actionable recommendations for business leaders, including the reports that are highlighted in this briefing. Weekly interviews with decision makers and insiders, a downloadable graphics library of relevant data visualizations that you can use to enhance your reports and brief your stakeholders, a free Friday newsletter that you can share with your team, and all of it infused with deeply sourced reporting by analysts who are also veteran journalists. And finally, these live briefings are our weekly real-time conversation with you. We are offering these as a complimentary taste of what we do for a limited time. And if you find them helpful and would like to attend throughout the year, we invite you to request a demo of our platform and consider subscribing. We hope to make this an hour worthy of appointment viewing. So last week, an audience member asked if closed captioning of this session is available, and the answer is yes. To show automated closed captions, just click the Show Captions icon in the Meeting Controls toolbar at the bottom of your screen, and captions will automatically appear above the Controls toolbar. So today, we are diving into a topic that we've been covering continuously and will be a big part of our coverage going forward. It's no secret that the race to build the world's largest computer farms is driving an explosion in electricity demand, straining an American energy system that is already ill-equipped to keep up. This has become a huge concern for both the energy and tech industries, for the federal government, and also for state governments. And all of you are represented in our audience today. We're really just so gratified by how many people have signed up from state and federal government offices, from companies, and from academia. Thank you so much for being here. We think it's a really important topic. So we're going to take a close look at the size and nature of the challenge, how government policymakers are responding, and finally, we'll take a look at several ways that AI technologies are now devising ways to lower the energy intensity of artificial intelligence. So to help us get smart quickly, we have two guests who've done some really great and seriously detailed work on this topic. Jason Dean is our lead tech and AI analyst at Washington Post Intelligence. He has written several deep dive reports on these topics, and they are available on our platform. And he joins us from the Washington Post San Francisco office. Jason, thanks for getting up early to join us today.
My pleasure, Louisa.
And we're also very grateful today to have a special guest. Thomas Spencer is a senior energy analyst at the International Energy Agency, and he's joining us from Paris. Thanks for being here, Thomas.
Great to be with you.
Now, we're particularly pleased that you could join us because the IEA has published its first special report looking at the outlook for energy demand driven by AI and the impact that will have on the grid. So we're just really looking forward to you sharing your insights from all that prodigious research you've all done. So I'm very excited to drill down. For the benefit of our audience, here's how we're going to organize our conversation. So first, we're going to take a look at the demand impact of AI at the global, national, and regional level and put that in some comparative context. Second, we're going to dive into recent moves by the Trump administration to accelerate energy production, and we'll analyze where the policy moves align or don't align with the projected need. We'll also discuss issues around energy distribution. And then third, we'll preview several innovations in AI technology that could potentially reduce the expected spike in energy demand if industry embraces them. And Jason just published last night a report on this topic, and I just truly recommend it. It's really excellent. I thought it was so lucid, so illuminating. I can't recommend it enough. So I'd also like to thank our audience for the questions that you sent in ahead of the briefing. There are so many good and thoughtful questions, and we've used them to help shape this conversation. And throughout our session today, I invite you to please drop your questions and comments into the chat, and we'll take relevant questions as we go along. I also want to underscore this is the first of many reports and briefings on this topic, so please continue to follow us if this issue matters to you and your work. So let's dive right in and wrap our arms around what exactly is driving the energy demand and the scale of the issue. So Jason, let's start with you, since you published a detailed report on our platform that addressed both energy demand and some of the policy moves that we'll get into in our second section. But in your report, you called the projected demand a, quote, paradigm shifting shock to the energy system. And you attribute this shock to a frenetic race to build the world's biggest data centers. And before we get into the gigawatts and the energy, can you just talk a bit about the data center race? There was an audience question that came in. I think it's a good place to start. What is the number of AI-based data centers that are to come online in the next few years? And what is the size? Help us just situate the size.
So one estimate is 200 data centers under construction in the U.S. right now, the U.S. alone, many more overseas. And not all of those are for AI, but increasingly that's what people are focusing on. It's an enormous number. There are already thousands of various sizes. The other trend, besides just accelerated growth in the number, is accelerated growth in the size. And so you're talking about data centers going from being measured in terms of their electrical consumption by the sort of hundreds of megawatts into being measured at the high end, really, to being measured by multiple gigawatts.
Mm-hmm. And you've written about Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Meta. They're going to spend $350 billion a year, and they're all trying to outdo each other. You talked about a single Meta platform facility needing 1 gigawatt of electricity. I wonder, Thomas, this is the picture in the US. How does this look if we zoom back to the global picture?
Yeah, so it's clear that the United States is a market leader in terms of data centers globally. So as of today, the United States accounts for almost 50% of installed capacity of data centers. Going forward, we expect the installed capacity of data centers to more than double globally by 2030. So going from 100 gigawatts today, which is roughly equivalent to the installed generation capacity of a country like Italy, to more than 230 gigawatts of installed capacity globally by 2030. And if you look at how that breaks down across the world, what we see is that the United States continues to be the market leader. In fact, its share of global installed capacity increases. And the second largest market is China. Together, the United States and China by 2030 would account for nearly 75% of installed capacity of data centers. The European Union would see its share actually decline somewhat, and we would see new data centers emerging in countries which have not to date really hosted large-scale data centers. So India, for example, countries in the Middle East as well.
Interesting. And Jason, you have this very dramatic graphic in your report that shows what this planned construction is doing to projections of electricity demand in the US. Can you talk a little bit about what we're seeing here in this huge line, this huge projected line?
Yes, so this is the dark blue there is AI data centers, and the light blue is total data center demand. And you can see that as of last year, AI focused data centers were really quite a small portion of the total, and that's projected to grow 31-fold. And part of the reason that's important is just the sheer intensity of the power use by AI data centers using GPUs, which are much, much more power hungry than the traditional chips that are put in traditional data centers.
31-fold increase in data demand from AI data centers over the next 10 years. That's very dramatic. Thomas, again, let's zoom out to the global picture. What will AI do to energy demand globally?
Certainly, we are projecting that electricity demand from data centers, largely driven by AI, will grow rapidly at the global level. Today, data centers account for about 1.5% of total electricity consumption at the global level, so not very significant in the big picture, but it is growing rapidly. We project that data centers will account for about 3% of global electricity consumption by 2030. And their total electricity consumption will reach about 950 terawatt hours by 2030. To put that in perspective, that's equivalent to the electricity consumption of a country like Japan. In the United States, again, because the United States is the market leader, the share of electricity consumption coming from data centers is higher than in the global average. It's about 4% today. We project that it could double to more than 10% by 2030, and that data centers will be by far the dominant source of load growth in the United States in the coming years, accounting for more than 50% of load growth in the United States from now to 2030.
More than 50%. That's amazing. And Thomas, here in the US, this demand, it's not being spread evenly across the country, right? I mean, it's sort of concentrated in certain places. Can you talk a little bit about what that load growth means regionally?
Yeah, so traditionally data centers have been quite clustered in terms of where they locate across the United States. And there's a few reasons for that. Generally speaking, they like to be located, close to customers because many customers are what we call latency sensitive. So that means that you want a short time between the query and the response coming back from the data center. They want it to be close to fiber optic equipment and so on. AI changes that picture a little bit because for training an AI model, latency sensitivity doesn't matter so much. And so what we see is there is a diversification of the location of data centers if you compare currently installed capacity with capacity under development. But that diversification is only partial. So take, for example, Virginia, which has by far the largest share of installed capacity in the United States, and in which 25% of electricity consumption already today comes from data centers, which is quite a striking statistic. Virginia still accounts for the largest share of capacity under development. So there is a momentum behind these existing markets, but you also see a diversification because power and infrastructure availability are becoming more and more important. So states like Texas accounts for the second largest share of capacity under development, for example, but also others like Nebraska, Wisconsin, which historically did not see much data center development.
Mm-hmm. A question from one of our audience members: are there opportunities for building data centers overseas as a backup? Is that something the industry, can they use overseas data centers to meet US demand for AI processing?
Yeah, I think that is, go ahead, Thomas.
No, after you.
I think that is something that companies are doing. There are projects, as Thomas mentioned, to build data centers in places like the Middle East. Those are to serve local demand, but also global demands. But I think there's a limit to how much companies are willing to put distance between the end consumers and the users. There are data restrictions as well, sovereign data restrictions. So that's, I think, why you see so much of the development by U.S. companies in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Jason, talk a little bit about how this is playing out regionally. We've seen a lot of concerns in states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, other places where state legislatures are starting to put tariffs on some of these data centers, saying if you're going to impose all these new demands and costs on our energy infrastructure, you should be paying for it. What are we seeing so far at the regional level?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's a push and a pull, right? Because some state officials want these projects. There's a large amount of capital investment that goes into them. There's a lot of construction jobs that are not permanent, but meaningful. At the same time, when you look at a state like Virginia, as Thomas mentioned, with 25% of the power going to data centers, it's an enormous amount, and that burden is shared across other electricity users. So when you have to upgrade a grid, when you have to add new equipment to handle the increase in capacity, when you're building new power plants, that's paid for by everyone, and that causes electricity rates to go up. So you're seeing a lot of consternation, not just from consumers and politicians, but from other businesses in other sectors. Walmart, for example, has complained about the rising electricity costs in multiple states and said that they have to rethink their future investment plans in states like Virginia and Ohio, where there's enormous data center construction happening. And again, that's part of the reason why with AI, you're seeing some geographic diversification in the future, as Thomas mentioned, because there are other states where you have less concentration, less pushback, less of a problem getting access to power and cheaper power.
Right, and I want to encourage our audience members, please share your questions with us so we can send them to the panelists. And there was an audience question, Thomas, that came in earlier, and maybe you could help walk us through how this is being monitored. There's a question asking, are energy regulatory agencies monitoring the U.S. energy requirements for AI versus energy needs being driven by cryptocurrency? And there's another one asking about cloud computing. To what degree would you expect AI to dominate and drive up the cost, or potentially crowd out other computing uses?
Yeah, it's a great question, and actually quite difficult to get a hand on the numbers. So I mentioned today data centers are about 415 terawatt hours of electricity consumption globally. Our estimate is that crypto is about 150 terawatt hours of electricity consumption. And then data networks, so these are 5G towers for mobile phone users and so on, is about another 400 terawatt hours of electricity consumption. It's actually quite difficult to get a handle on how much of data center electricity consumption is specifically related to AI. The best proxy, in our view, is the electricity consumption of so-called accelerated servers. So these are servers that are going in, basically the computers that are going into data centers that have specialized chips in them, like graphics processing units and other similar specialized chips. And so these are typically, but not always, designed for AI-related uses. And that therefore provides a good proxy for total AI electricity consumption in data centers. And in our estimate, it's about 20% of data center electricity consumption today that is coming from these specialized and often AI optimized servers.
So can you just repeat those three numbers for AI, crypto, and networks, you said?
Yeah, so the data centers are about 415 terawatt hours of electricity consumption. Of that, accelerated servers, often but not always used for AI, is about 20%. Then crypto is about 150 terawatt hours, and data networks, all the data transfers around the world, is about another 400 terawatt hours.
Got it. Well, that's a really helpful comparison. I hadn't seen that before. We have a question about the impact on climate change. Is anyone tracking these technologies with regard to their climate change impact? And I know this has been a big issue for some of the tech companies that have made some commitments on reducing their climate footprint. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I mean, data centers themselves don't really emit directly. They emit via their electricity consumption. We estimate at the IEA that data centers account for about 180 million tons of CO2 emissions via their electricity consumption. So that's indirect emissions. To put that in perspective, total global emissions from the energy sector are more than 37 billion tons. So data centers are still a very small share of total energy sector emissions.
Gotcha. Jason, did you want to add to that?
Just that I think in the future, that mix is changing, and we can talk about that a little bit more in the next section. But a lot of power in the U.S. in recent years going to data centers has come from renewable energy, and that may be shifting somewhat under the current policy environment in the U.S.
Yeah, well, that's a perfect segue. So we wanted to talk about the actual energy generation, which has been the focus of the policy solutions by the US federal government. And Jason, just in July, the Trump administration issued its AI action plan, and accelerating the construction of data centers was a centerpiece of that. And the administration took aggressive aim at US environmental rules and other regulations that, in its words, quote, made it almost impossible to build this infrastructure in the United States with the speed that is required. And there was also an executive order issued to accelerate energy production specifically for AI. Can you tell us a little bit about the executive order?
Yes, so a lot of this is about streamlining the permitting process. And, if you talk to people in the industry, it has been cumbersome. It's not just the idea of taking a good, hard, thorough look, but you just have the problem of multiple agencies and offices involved. And, one agency has 30 days to look at something, and it sits in an inbox for a while, and then it goes over to the next one and it sits in an inbox for a while. So they're trying to streamline that part of the process. Ideally without sacrificing, thorough scrutiny of the environmental impact, although obviously people disagree and think that could be sacrificed. But it's a lot about making a more rapid approval process. They're also designating certain categories of projects around data centers of a certain size in terms of capital investment or electricity consumption to be eligible for additional federal money. And so, the big push there is on accelerating the process of getting these power plants built, because they can take a really long time to not only construct, but then get connected to the grid. That is really heavily focused, however, on fossil fuel plants for the time being.
Mm-hmm. And Jason, I wanted to share a graphic from your report that shows U.S. electricity production by source. So can you kind of walk through what the mix currently looks like, and how the administration's new policies are likely to impact this?
Yeah, so you can see that renewables have grown significantly as a share of the total mix. Nuclear is shrunk somewhat. Coal is going down. Natural gas is growing very quickly. But the trend has been growth in gas and rapid growth in wind and really solar. That is, there's still some tailwinds, if you will, on that, because the tech companies remain interested in developing that. They still have lots of commitments to reducing their carbon footprint that those renewable projects can be a part of. But this administration is completely out on wind and solar, and that's meaningful. They are making it more difficult to build those projects for not just utilities, but for the tech companies that want to build them. Anything that involves federal land or federal permitting is going to have a harder time in the renewable space.
Mm-hmm. Thomas, can you talk a little bit about what that energy mix looks like in China? You talked about China being the other big data center builder. We have an audience question asking, given China's advantages in infrastructure and energy, is there evidence that China's data center build out can outpace and outcompete? What does the Chinese picture look like?
Yeah, so it's quite interesting actually, because in March of this year, the National Development and Reform Commission, so the main regulatory body in China, issued new guidelines for data centers, and in particular, for our purposes here, issued a renewable portfolio standard for data centers. So this is essentially a renewables purchase requirement for data centers that requires them to purchase as much renewable electricity to meet the same share of renewables in their electricity consumption as the national average. And over time, we've seen that renewables have been taking a larger share of total Chinese electricity generation. Today they're at about 1/3 of China's electricity generation. 10 years ago, that was about 10 percentage points lower, so around 20%. What's quite interesting as well is that they've set renewables portfolio standards for so-called national hub data centers. So these are, priority large-scale projects that mandates them to procure renewables up to 80% of their consumption by 2030. It's important to note that data centers in China can meet this by purchasing green certificates from renewables projects connected to the broader electricity grid. So this is not, data centers isolated from the electricity grid, purchasing renewables from projects isolated from the electricity grid. It is still the broader electricity grid which supports the balancing of variable renewables. But the purchase obligation on data centers will be a driver of new capacity additions into the Chinese electricity grid.
Mm-hmm. There's an audience question sort of related to that. Maybe one of you could weigh in. How many states or countries are requiring on-site generation for data centers or requiring data centers to have power purchase agreements? So it sounds like the Chinese are being quite prescriptive about what the power generation looks like. Are we seeing any of that in the US or Europe?
I think the U.S. companies are doing that. I'm not. It's not a regulatory requirement as much as something that the companies are developing PPAs to try to meet their own carbon commitments. They're developing sort of behind the meter plans to try to just meet their own energy demand without having to necessarily rely on grid connections. So that's a part of it. But I don't think it's the sort of top-down mandate that we're seeing in China.
Mm-hmm. And what are you saying, Thomas?
Yeah, so I mean, in Europe, if you look at wholesale electricity prices, they're quite high. The natural gas price is quite high in Europe as well. It equates to, for electricity generation, about $70 per megawatt hour just for the variable cost. That's not including the fixed costs of the natural gas plant, so it's quite expensive. And the European electricity generation is already quite decarbonized, so more than 75% from renewables and nuclear. So there is a general preference in Europe for procurement from renewables, also as a hedge against those high wholesale prices. But there's also, quite substantial challenges with permitting delays, siting selection, and so on in Europe as well.
Mm-hmm. Jason, in your earlier report, you talked a lot about the risks for the tech industry coming from the administration's focus on fossil fuels and sort of to the exclusion of renewables. Can you talk about what you learned about the demand versus the projected supply and what some of the obstacles are that the tech industry could face to fueling their development?
Yeah, I think there's several issues. One is just how much electricity can you get access to, how quickly, and again, renewables have been a real practical and important part of the answer to that question over the last several years in the U.S. You can build wind and solar very quickly. In the past, you've been able to do that, less so in the future, and that's a constraint. I mean, there's a desire in the administration to speed up the approvals for the federal environmental approvals for new natural gas power plants, but that's only one part of the equation. You have to get access to, first of all, the equipment to build those plants. There's a long waiting list to get new gas turbines. For example, there's just not enough of them. And then you have other issues with connecting those plants once they're built to the grid. That's a separate approval process that takes a while. You have states involved as well. So having access to a full range of different options in terms of building power supply, makes it easier to meet the demand for the data centers that is so important to them. I think the other risk is, American politics. The political pendulum swings quite a lot, and while the idea of focusing on climate concerns in your power generation plan is not in favor with this current administration, that could change in several years. And so a lot of the people that I talked to spoke about the need to be thinking about the long term, both in terms of like having adequate supply and in terms of making sure that you're on track to be able to meet climate needs longer term.
Gotcha. We've had a couple more questions here on energy production, and then we'll move to distribution. But one question is, will it take too long to use small nuclear reactors for data sites? Thomas, what are you seeing about that? How long would that take?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of interest in nuclear because of the rise of data centers. And, we talk a lot about small modular reactors, but there's also, the issue of life extensions for existing reactors, particularly in advanced economies where these are coming to the end of their lifetimes, but those lifetimes can be extended with a bit of investment. So we're seeing Meta signing an agreement with Constellation Energy, Amazon signing an agreement with Talon Energy to extend the lifetime of existing reactors in the United States. And then when we look at small modular reactors, we at the IEA track all the data on this. We have recorded expressions of interest from the tech sector for small modular reactors equivalent to 25 gigawatts. And the vast majority of that is in the United States. But these are, of course, only at this point expressions of interest. We saw very recently, the first power purchase agreement between Google, Kairos Energy, and the Tennessee Valley Authority for Kairos Energy's demonstration plant that is coming up in Oak Ridge. So some of those expressions of interest are starting to translate into PPAs. But the general expectation, and that's also what we assume in our analysis and our modeling, that small modular reactors will, first of all, not come online at an appreciable scale until after 2030. And that secondly, the tech sector can't do it by itself. There will also need to be policy support for the sector. And there it's quite interesting to come back to the Kairos project in Oak Ridge, which has actually benefited from financial support from the DOE's Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program. So the tech sector is quite consistent in their messaging on this, that they can't do it by themselves. They're very interested, but they can't do it by themselves.
Mm-hmm. We had more than one question about fusion. How feasible are small mini fusion reactors as an alternative in the long term?
I would just...
Do you want to be Jason? Go ahead.
Fusion is always the energy of tomorrow. I think there's a lot of work being put into it, and there's a lot of excitement that maybe we are getting closer. But that I think is even further out as a real solution than small reactors. And in general, nuclear is one area where there's pretty broad agreement. I mean, there are obviously opponents to nuclear power in the U.S., but there's bipartisan agreement. The Trump administration fully supports the idea of nuclear as a solution. The tech companies, as Thomas said, are very interested in this. It's just it's a little like my son telling me about this great idea he has for his term paper, but telling me he's going to get started on it in 3 weeks, and it's like, well, it's due in a couple of days. So this is not a solution that's going to come on in the near term. It's going to take a lot longer. Whether it's fusion, whether it's traditional nuclear reactors. I mean, the U.S. is not building nuclear reactors of any sort right now. China's building like 31 or 32 of them. So as a meaningful solution in the U.S. in particular, this is more further out on the horizon.
All right. Well, we've talked about generation. Well, what about the questions about distribution and the actual energy infrastructure that will be needed to be upgraded to make all this work? There's a question from the audience. How much of a limitation is the U.S. electrical distribution infrastructure, and what is being done to expand it? Thomas, do you want to start? And then maybe Jason, you weigh in.
Yeah, this is a major constraint. I would say, to power a data center, obviously you need the energy source, but you've got to transform that energy source into electricity, and you've got to transmit the electricity to the data center. In the US and in advanced economies more broadly, the grid is quite old. 50% of the grid capacity in advanced economies, and this holds also for the US, is more than 20 years old. We've seen, an uptick in the electrical grid in the United States, but it's still lagging behind a bit. And just to put this in perspective, one of the major challenges that we face with powering data centers is the approval times for new transmission capacity. So for a data center, for example, you can be built in 18 months or so, but data center size transmission line can be built in 4 to 8 years on average in a country like the US. So this is a major challenge, and it will require policy support, but also innovation to solve.
Jason,
Yeah, I would just add to that. There's also, again, a parts issue when it comes to this. There's a regulatory and approval issue, and there's also just a lack of key grid components available for purchase, like transformers. And historically, a lot of those have not been made in the US. So when you look at the tariff policy that's being enacted by the Trump administration, I think part of the goal is to onshore some of these industries, but in the meantime, that's making it more expensive to purchase some of these components, as well as some of the materials that go into making them in the US. So that's not making things any easier.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, upgrading the grid, building these lines all costs money. We have a question from the audience. As AI development accelerates faster than grid modernization, how should we balance innovation with the ethical responsibility to protect vulnerable communities from higher costs and reliability risks? Is this a concern, Thomas?
Yeah, it's a major challenge for policymakers, and it's a major challenge also because of the uncertainty in the outlook for data center electricity demand, and that time lag between the time it can take to build a data center versus the time it takes to build electrical infrastructure. So essentially, we will have to make large investments in transmission capacity, in generation capacity, which will be paid back over the long term from ratepayers, but in order to serve a demand outlook which is quite uncertain. And I think that will take, an unprecedented amount of dialogue between the energy sector, between the tech sector, between public interest stakeholders, and between policymakers to get that balance right.
And Jason, I guess this accounts for why some states are already beginning to put tariffs on these fees on these data centers because of the additional costs that would otherwise pass on to ratepayers, right?
That's right. Yeah, and it goes to something you raised earlier, Louisa. I think the risks here for the tech sector, that there's a lot of wariness of AI. There's a lot of excitement about what it can do. There's a lot of concern about impact on jobs and stuff that's further out in the future. Right now, there's a lot of concern about what it's doing to people's pocketbooks in terms of rising electricity rates, and that's something that the enlightened people in the tech community are very conscious of trying to manage and get ahead of, not just in terms of spin, but in terms of trying to adopt solutions that can mitigate those increases.
Yeah, so let's talk about some of those solutions. And I know you've spent time talking to technologists and leaders at a lot of these companies about where the cutting edge is. Maybe we'll start with Thomas on the big picture. So the IEA has projected 3 alternative cases to their base case energy estimates. And we have a graphic that you put together, which also appeared in Jason's report. Maybe we could share that. It shows the different futures for AI and energy. Thomas, do you want to walk us through what we're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, watching this area very closely over the last 18 months, it's almost like watching a tennis match. You get pulled in this direction with one piece of news, and then you get pulled in that direction with another piece of news. And it's very hard to, formulate expectations for the future. I mean, just let me give you a few examples. On the potential upside for the electricity demand from AI, you of course have the question of the extent of uptake, and so it's pretty clear that ChatGPT, just as an example, is one of the fastest, if not the fastest, consumer applications in the IT industry in terms of user base. So the uptake of AI has been unprecedentedly rapid. Another factor on the upside is the evolution of more energy intensive models. So for example, the emergence of what are called reasoning models. So these are models that essentially think more to give you an answer. It's pretty clear that they're more energy intensive than a classic large language model like ChatGPT. The emergence of video and image models, which are also more energy intensive than text models. That's also a factor that is pulling things on the upside. But on the downside, there's tremendous innovation that's taking place in terms of energy efficiency on both the hardware and the software. So, I mean, we made a calculation that training ChatGPT cost about the electricity consumption of the city of Paris. If we had tried to do it on the chips available 20 years ago, it would have consumed more electricity than the entire consumption of China today. So that's how fast and significant exactly. That's how fast and significant the innovation has been in chips. But we're also seeing it on the model side. Models getting more and more energy efficient, so that quite capable models can be run on our phones now. And so I think navigating this uncertainty, we have to look at different cases and different scenarios, and then watch the space very carefully and try and situate where we think we're going. And that's what we tried to do in our report.
And what is your advice then to energy companies and energy investors, given that there's all this excitement, there's going to be this big energy boom, but I mean, historically, I think sometimes these technologies that are expected to be big energy guzzlers get efficient very quickly.
Yeah, and we've seen this in the past. Our economies have become more and more digitalized over the last 20 years. But for the last 15 years up to roughly 2020, electricity consumption from data centers didn't actually grow very much at all, globally or in the United States, because efficiency improvements ran ahead of the growing demand for digital services. And then around 2020, that started to shift with the emergence of AI. So it is a challenging thing to navigate. Our approach at the IEA is to try and understand the underlying technology as well as we can. So we're partnering with the tech industry, with the Microsofts, the Googles, the OpenAIs, to try and understand where the technology itself is going, because that will help us to get a better sense of where the electricity consumption could go going forward. Obviously, the investments are pointing towards a big uptick in electricity consumption in the near term, and those are projects that have broken ground and are going ahead. So I think the picture for the near term, let's say the next 4 or 5 years, is relatively clear that electricity consumption will grow, but the longer term is maybe a bit more uncertain.
That's interesting. Well, I want to take this a little bit from the abstract to the very concrete. And Jason, you have a new report that just published last night where you talked about a couple of these new technological innovations that could significantly reduce electricity demand caused by AI. And the first one, let's start with, is new chip designs. So what's the change there?
Yeah, so one of the things that's important to understand, as I'm sure a lot of our audience does, is the distinction between training AI models and what's called inference. That's the work that is done by AI computers to actually answer our queries or to do the work that we assign to AI agents, et cetera. And that inference work is very different from training work. It's different in a number of ways. It doesn't. One of them is the math doesn't have to be as precise. It doesn't need to be done with these kinds of extremely intense giant clusters. And inference isn't something where the software advantage that NVIDIA has with its GPUs, which are really, the software is as much a part of the attraction to the GPUs of NVIDIA as the hardware. That also, it doesn't have that kind of lock-in and inference. So we have a number of companies that are pioneering new chip designs that are really tailored for inference, and can do it much more efficiently. Companies like Cerebras Systems, Grok, not Elon Musk's Grok, but spelled GROQ, and a company called Positron, and they're doing different things, but a lot of it amounts to the very basic idea of moving information less far, less often. So in the case of Cerebras Systems, they make their chips very, very large. Usually to make a chip of any sort, you start with etching microscopic circuits on a 12-inch wafer of silicon, and then you chop that up into different chips. They use basically the whole disk, and that enables them to move information around without having to go off of a chip and translate that data into electricity that goes over copper wires on a motherboard or whatever. It's much more energy efficient. That's one way. Grok and Positron are using different techniques, but all of them are better tailored to inference, and you can get energy savings versus the use of GPUs here of 2 or more times. So the idea that as we are using AI more, we can use chips that are better for that use than GPUs that are much more energy efficient is one reason to have some optimism about the possibility of flattening that curve that Thomas was talking about.
Mm-hmm. And the second innovation that you mentioned were changes to the AI models themselves. What does that look like?
Yeah, Thomas alluded to this. So there's two things happening right now. One is this ongoing race to have the biggest, baddest, most powerful model, and every few weeks or a couple of months or whatever, OpenAI comes out with a new one, or Anthropic comes out with a new one, or Elon Musk comes out with a new one, and it's supposed to be the best, and it beats all the benchmarks. The other thing that's happening is people are doing more and more work to look at the power of smaller models, and so these giant models are designed to be able to do everything and to do it, with more and more kind of thinking power. You don't need that for all tasks. Sometimes you can really focus them, and the metaphor, there are a bunch of metaphors that are fun. I like people talk about, using a giant model for a more narrow task as being like driving an advanced battle tank to the corner store for milk. Another executive I talked to spoke of using a chainsaw to cut a cheeseburger, which sounds pretty messy. But the idea is that if you shrink these models to focus them on the task, you can get 90% reduction in power use with no decrease in accuracy, and sometimes actually an improvement in accuracy. That's not easy, it's not universal, but that can be done. And Google is one example. They've decreased the median electricity use for a median text query to the Gemini apps by 97% over the past year, primarily through these kinds of software modifications. And there's different ways that companies are doing it. You can round numbers, and this is all math. You can round numbers. You can use small models to do some of the prediction and have the large models verify them. So there's lots of work being done on this, and it shows a lot of promise also for reducing electricity demand.
Now that is fascinating. And the third item that you mentioned was actually using AI-driven software to improve the operations of data centers and how they use electricity. And you had a map in your report that kind of shows where AI is located, where the data centers are located right now, and how they could use energy more efficiently. Can you kind of talk us through that?
Yeah, so the importance of the map here is, it shows both the heavy concentrations in some areas, but also the fact that they're being spread out, as Thomas was saying earlier, into new locations really across the country. Why does that matter? Well, grid management is not really about the aggregate. It's about specific demand cycles in specific regions. What I mean is, most of the time in any given area, we have way more power generation capacity than is needed. But the grid has to operate on the basis of spikes. It has to be have enough generating capacity so that when you have everybody turn their air conditioners on all at once, for example, you don't have outages, because outages are a huge pain. They can be dangerous. They can be deadly. And so you have to manage for those peaks. And when people talk about building hundreds of gigawatts or tens or hundreds of gigawatts of power to meet the demand of AI, they're really talking about managing those peaks. If you can shave off the peaks, if you can redistribute the AI workload, then you don't need to build as much capacity. You already have it. And as long as you're not adding loads that risk, outages, that's good for everybody. So one of the companies that I talked to is a startup called Emerald AI. They've developed this AI-driven software that rebalances the workloads. And this is a lot easier to do with inference than it is with training. But as we talked about, inference is a larger and larger share of the total computing work. If a data center in Texas is operating on is doing inference work at a time when there's a sudden spike in electricity demand in that grid, this software could either delay some of that work, if that's possible, or redistribute it to a different data center in another part of the country. Maybe it's in Wyoming, where that's far away from that grid and is not experiencing that kind of peak demand. You can do similar things within data centers to make the computing work much more efficient. And that also, again, can mitigate the need to be building all of these additional power plants.
Mm-hmm. And Thomas, how far do these different innovations get us in terms of reducing the energy need? Will this close the whole gap, or do we still need to build even under this more efficient, evenly distributed, shaving down the spikes scenario?
Yeah, it's pretty clear that the problem is so large, the challenge is so large that we will need all available solutions. So we'll need to build new generation capacity, we'll need to build new transmission lines, we'll need to do what we can to make data centers more flexible, but we'll also need to do what we can to to roll out innovative approaches on our electrical grids to make the most of the capacity that exists today in our transmission network before we can build new capacity. So, for example, you can use AI to monitor the real-time state of transmission lines and increase their effective capacity closer to their nameplate capacity, and therefore allow them to transfer for more power. We could use batteries to defer the time-consuming investments in new transmission capacity for a few years, and that will buy us time. So we really need an all-of-the-above strategy on this because the problem is so large. And certainly, what Jason was talking about is extremely interesting. If we can shave just small peaks off data center electricity consumption at peak times, it can make a big difference.
That is fascinating. So in all our briefings, I like to take a minute just to talk about what's coming next. So Jason, can you give us a preview of what you'll be covering next week for our subscribers?
We're going to be looking at the battle over AI regulation between industry and government, between different levels of government in the U.S., federal government versus state government, and U.S. versus other countries. It's incredibly complicated, and there's a lot of disagreement over who should have the ability and the right to do this.
I am looking forward to that report very much. And Thomas, what is on your radar? What are you working on next, and what should our audience be looking out for?
Yeah, we're essentially doing three things. The first is continuing to update our projections for electricity consumption from data centers because it's such a rapidly moving field. We need to keep putting out these projections so that industry has something to benchmark against in terms of what the outlook looks like. The second area goes to what Jason was talking about, diving deeper into how we can integrate data centers into our electricity systems in a secure, rapid way to meet the challenge. So all of the solutions that we were talking about just now. And the third is, one of the things that the IEA does a lot is convene exactly this kind of discussion with policymakers, with the tech industry, with the energy industry. And there's a huge appetite for that because it's such a novel field. And these three communities haven't really been talking to each other up until now. And so creating the space for that is one of the IEA's critical value adds.
That's fantastic. And we certainly look forward to having you back as we also continue to explore these issues. And I think Jason and I have been talking about digging in more at the state level in the coming months and the coming year, as this is very much a regional issue. And as you say, bringing together experts and stakeholders and really understanding the picture and the options, the sort of the policy and the business options on the ground in some of these regions. Thank you so much, Jason and Thomas, for all your insights. And thank you to our audience for joining us. Please feel free to subscribe to our Friday newsletter at WAPO. That's wapo.st/intelligence. That comes out every Friday morning. And you can request a demo of our platform by clicking the link on your screen. And block your calendar for Fridays at 11 a.m. That is our regular time for our intelligence briefings. And next week, next Friday at 11, I'll be joined by our lead global security analyst, Josh Rogan, to talk about the growing risk of exposure for multinationals and U.S. capital markets that are doing business in China, that are investing in Chinese companies. There's a lot going on behind the scenes in Congress and in the administration and at the SEC that Josh will be briefing about. And in the meantime, we'll send you a link to a recording of this briefing. And please take a moment to fill out the extremely short post-briefing survey that we send out. Your input is really important to us and helps us improve each week. And thank you so much for your time. And we'll see you next Friday.